I wasn't raised in a Christian home. In fact, I was born on a little farm down in southern Missouri. We was about 7 miles north of Arkansas. And they used to accuse us having one leg shorter than another for walking around on them hills. But there was 12 of us kids in our family. My dad usually called the roll when we come to supper. But we had a lot of fun down there as I was growing up as a youngster, and we didn't have a whole lot as far as material things, but I really loved my dad, and my dad always took time for me, always, and he taught me a lot of things. When I was 13 years old, my dad dropped dead of a heart attack, and we'd made a lot of plans together, and that wasn't in it. And I really loved that man. And I didn't have him anymore, and it took me about 6 months before I could come to grips with that. It just absolutely destroyed me. And I felt cheated. I got angry at the world. And so I struck out in rebellion. Nobody led me into sin. There wasn't any wrong crowd that come and got me. I built the wrong crowd and went and got others. And I really went into some bad things and really broke my mother's heart and just struck out at the world. And I got caught up in it, and we had a little home brew project down the gym, and principal didn't think a lot of that, and so I got expelled. And finally I got old enough where a good friend of mine decided that maybe I ought to try the service. He was the deputy sheriff. And so I went in the service, got on the Greyhound bus, and I was sizing everybody up to see what's going on. We got on down there to the place where they was going to do basic training on us. And I was sizing guys up, and there was a fella out there hollering to everybody, line up and fall in and all that. And we was horsing around. You know, I was playing the role as a big gunner. And this fellow come over and said, young man, you hear me? I said, fall in over. I said, I'll be there in a minute. He hit me, I hit the ground. I was looking up at that fellow, and he was a good-sized fellow, about an 18.5-inch neck. And he picked me up and put me in the line there, and he got in front of us and he said, man, I want to tell you something. He said, I'll be your mother, your father, your girlfriend, your chaplain. I'm everything to you. And I believed him. And the thought crossed my mind at that time that maybe there was one or two things I hadn't learned yet. So I tried to pay attention, and I went on about my business there in the Army, but it really took a hold of me, and it was the dynamic that I needed, discipline. My father's a disciplinarian. I had missed a lot of that, and so I appreciated this sergeant, and it became my DI, and he taught me a lot of things. And one thing he taught me, shut my mouth. I worked hard and tried to pay attention, finally got out of basic without dying, and got on into the service and really tried to make something of myself. And after my first hitch, I thought, well, that's it. I've taught them about all I can here, and I guess I better go on back. So I went on back home, and when I got off the bus, there was my dear friend. And so me and the deputy got in his car, and we went down, had some coffee, and he said, you know, Don, we've cleaned up a lot of places around here in them 3 years, and he went on to tell me a lot of things and convinced me that I really wasn't needed there any longer, and that I ought to go out and further the education of other communities. So I decided the best thing for me to do is get back in the service. So I did, and I hadn't been back in long, and I was a sergeant then, and the company commander called me in and said, we're sending you to OCS. I said, no, I don't want to go. He said, I didn't ask you that. You're going to OCS. It's pretty difficult to argue when you stand at attention. So I went on to OCS, and I wouldn't go through that school again for Brigadier General. I finally got out and got my commission, and then I went on back home on furlough and spied this little girl that I'd tried to date. In fact, she was a church person, and her family was church people. They weren't saved, but they had a lot of religion, a lot of ritual, but nothing real. And she thought, well, I'll go ahead and marry this fella. I'll change him, get him straight away, And so we got married, and she made the tactful mistake of thinking that she was going to change me. I was a heavy drinker by then, and I was really a workaholic. I worked very hard. One day I was at the Command General Staff College. I'd gone to Vietnam and had survived that, and came back and was promoted again and went to Command General Staff College. And I was there working very hard, wanting to make very good in the Commandant's list and the top 10% of the class, and didn't have time at all for my family. I just kind of used them. I didn't really have time. I hadn't told my wife I loved her since I conned the preacher into marrying us. And I didn't love her. I had affection for her. I had lust after her. She met a part of my life that I needed companionship in, but I didn't love her. I didn't know how to love because I wore a great big mask. You see, I loved my dad desperately. And as a result of that, when I lost him, I couldn't get hurt again. And so I put on a big mask and a big front. And I went back to Vietnam again, and this time I had a little more rank. And she, before I had gone to Vietnam this last time, she tried to commit suicide. Praise God, she was unsuccessful. And the neighbor then, a few days after the trauma wore off, came over and presented Jesus Christ in a real way, and she got saved. And she tried to tell me about her faith and her Lord, and I didn't want to hear it. I didn't have time for Jesus. One day she said, don't you think maybe you ought to get your kids to Sunday school? I allowed to tell you, I probably ought to do that, and it's probably good for the career. I'm getting close to general, and I ought to have everything squared away. And so we went downtown in a little bitty church and got down there and went in, and something scared me right away. There was some men in the church. Now, I'd been in and out of churches quite a bit. I used to date young girls. Their folks had never told them about guys like me. Going to churches real easy, no problem. And I'd see a lot of women. See a man up there behind the thing, and a lot of women. Some retired fella maybe giving out bulletins, and a real nice fella, but I didn't see the ruggedness of manhood that I had been trained was a man. I didn't see any men standing for their faith. And so when I walked in this little church, and here was two big dudes, remind me of that DI that had put me through it. And they said, welcome, how are you? One almost broke my hand, the other one dislocated my shoulder. And it really bothered me. Well, these guys are men. What are they doing in a church? So I went over and sat down with my family and everybody there, and in came this choir and this fellow, white hair, crew cut, the great big Bible in his hand. They come in and the choir did their thing, and he opened the book and got up and started to preach. And he said, open up to John. And everybody's rustling. I looked around, and every one of them men had a Bible. I'd never seen that before. And pretty soon I was sitting there, and one of these fellas come over and plop, and there was a Bible in my hand now. I was about halfway through the service before my son said, turn it over, turn it over. And I was sweating, miserable. That guy's talking about Jesus Christ paying the price for my sin and all my phoniness and all my rottenness already paid for, all that debt already canceled. And I got up and left. And after a while, I was out there smoking. I looked like Kaiser Steel. It was just miserable. Thought I'd have to get better to die. And finally, she came out. Everybody come out. I got in the car, laid some rubber out, went back to the fort. I said, that man's crazy. Don't ever ask me to go back down here again. In the past, she would have been on me like ugly on an ape. She just said, yes, dear. Fine. That made me madder, and I just commenced cussing and ranting and raving, and I finally shut up when my children started crying. I was miserable that week. I was sick. That guy was crazy. He kept saying something about Pilate, a fellow by the name of Pilate, and they